My name is Anne Lauterbach, and it is my honor to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Jonathan Kay, and to lead our discussion. And I hope you will join in the discussion readily. In Jonathan Kay's illuminating and provocative book, Among the Truthers, A Journey Through America's Growing Conspiracist Underground, the word paranoia occurs often, suggesting that those who contend that we do not know the whole truth about certain persons and events are indeed delusional, projecting onto reality alternative explanations that arise from the most mundane to the most evolved states of anguished disbelief. In his detailed portraits, Kay shows that conspiracists belong to no particular social group or political persuasion. He suggests that the growing tendency to assert counterfactual evidence is not only undermining the very fabric of our intellectual life, it is also a symptom of an active claim for ways of thinking about truth that are outside the conventions of empirical, rationalist, secular systems of knowledge. In the words of a Tea Party pamphlet, to acknowledge the centrality of faith in America. Kay writes, "Truthers' arcane, detailed theories about internal demolition, NORAD complicity, and CIA Al-Qaeda complicity aren't just paranoid fairy tales. They are fundamental narratives in the construction of this alternative reality, told and retold at truther gatherings in the same ritualized manner that Psalms and Torah portions are read at religious services. Like other radicalized political movements of our time, the truth movement transcends political activism. For many adherents, it has become the dominant spiritual force in their lives." Jonathan Kay was born in Montreal. He holds 2 degrees in metallurgy and engineering from McGill and a law degree from Yale. Before turning to journalism, he worked in Australia and Japan and as a lawyer in New York, where his expertise was U.S. tax analysis of international corporate transactions. 13 years ago, he abandoned law to become a journalist and is now comments page editor for the Toronto-based newspaper National Post, where he is a columnist and blogger. He contributes often to Commentary Magazine and the New York Post. His articles have appeared in a variety of distinguished American publications and .com publications, including The New Yorker and Harper's and Slate.com. Today, he is going to talk to us about conspiracy theories that have arisen since the publication of his book, about the lessons he learned in writing it, and about the psychological origins of the so-called birther phenomenon. Please join me in welcoming to Bard and to the 2011 Hannah Arendt Conference, Jonathan Kay. I've never met him, so I'm going to shake his hand.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, which was better than a Wikipedia entry, as Zadie Smith said. Although Zadie said it with a sense of exasperation. For me, the day I got my Wikipedia entry was like the greatest day of my life. And I didn't even write it. As a point of principle, I was going to wait till someone else wrote it, and then, of course, I spent the next week editing it. But as a point of principle, I didn't create it. Lewis Lapham, who of course was at this podium earlier in the day, said something very interesting. He said, "The truth doesn't have a big fan base. It's not a popular product." And that really echoed in my ear, because that's exactly what I heard from publishers when I pitched my book about conspiracy theories. It was published in May, but I pitched it in 2008. At first, they were extremely excited about it. So, "Oh, you're writing a book about conspiracy? Great! Do you believe the lizards are taking over, or some kind of zombie apocalypse? I said, no, this is a book debunking conspiracy theories about how we have to be more rational, and they became much less excited. They said, well, that sounds a little dry. But then Adam Bellow, who's an editor at HarperCollins, took a chance on me, and for that I'm grateful. The result was my book, Among the Truthers, that came out earlier this year. In my book, I talk about a whole bunch of conspiracy theories. And I think it's important to talk about conspiracy theories at any conference about truth-telling, because I think conspiracy theories are both a symptom and a cause of a media culture and an internet culture that promotes nonsense, for reasons that I'm going to explain. But before I get into the theory, I'd like to give you a little case study. And the case study involves something that happened after my book was published. The case study involves Anders Breivik, who, of course, was the killer who killed dozens of people in Norway in July of 2011, several months after my book was published. At the time, I was on book tour when this tragedy occurred. But one night, I instinctively went back to a lot of the websites that I had used to research my book, sort of conspiracy theory websites, because I was curious what the conspiracy theorists were saying about this horrible mass slaughter that took place in Norway. Of course, we all know the truth of it. It was, the killer composed this turgid 1,400-page manifesto explaining his motives. No mystery there. But still, I was interested in what the conspiracy theorists were saying about it. So I went to these websites. And what was interesting to me was that the conspiracy theories about the Norway killings were actually 3 different conspiracy theories. And I'm going to go briefly through all of them. The first conspiracy theory was that the Norway shootings were actually a clever plot by Muslims to discredit cultural conservatives in Europe. And the lead on this particular conspiracy theory is taken by a website that some of you may know. It's called WorldNet Daily. I don't know if anyone has seen this particular site. It's become more famous as a clearinghouse for Barack Obama birther conspiracy theories, but they also dabble in other conspiracies. And this is what appeared a day or two after the Norway shootings. Quote, "This has all the appearances of a cover-up," radio host Michael Savage told WorldNet Daily. "They created their Reichstag fire. They found their Timothy McVeigh. They created their Jack Ruby. How could one man have blown up downtown Oslo and then raced to the island to kill those teenagers? This is likely a fabrication of the Norwegian Labour Party, who needs to hold on to power to enforce their multiculturalist, Muslim-favoring, anti-nationalist views." End quote. So that's the first conspiracy theory, that it was multiculturalists and Muslims who were trying to discredit conservatives. The second Norway conspiracy theory was that the attacks were actually part of a New World Order plot to create fear and anxiety in Europe so that they could ram a collectivist banking agenda down Europe's throat. And the lead on this one was taken by a guy named Alex Jones. I'm not sure if people in this room know who Alex Jones is. Maybe you've seen him. He has a popular internet-based radio show. He's a particular hero among Ron Paul supporters. And here's the way Jones reported it, the Norway shootings. Quote, "They are now pulling out all the stops in an effort to crush resistance to endless bailouts designed to crash local economies and destroy national sovereignty. It is no mistake the corporate media is comparing Anders Breivik to Timothy McVeigh. Hours after the terrorist attack, Norway's public broadcaster said the attack resembled the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma, which, as we all know, was a false flag event used to roll out draconian aspects of the American police state in the 1990s. Breivik is obviously just a patsy for those seeking to destroy political opposition to the world's neoliberal bankers." End quote. All right, so first conspiracy theory, Muslims and multiculturalists. Second conspiracy theory, the world's international bankers. The third conspiracy theory was that Anders Breivik was actually a stooge of the Israelis, because Israel wanted to publish Norway's pro-Palestinian politicians. And the lead on this one was taken by a 9/11 conspiracy theorist by the name of Kevin Barrett, who actually lives in Wisconsin. He said, quote, "Friday's bloodbath in progressive Norway bears the markings of an Israeli Mossad false flag terror attack. No Western country has supported the Palestinian cause more than the Norwegians, end quote. All right, so there you have it. Anders Breivik was a tool of the bankers, the Jews, and the Muslims. And of course, we know all this. This is nonsense, of course. We know all this is nonsense. But it's representative nonsense. It's representative of the millions of conspiracy theories that you're going to find on the internet. Because, first of all, what are conspiracy theories? They are theories of evil. They answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? This is a question that used to be answered through religion, but for many people we now live in a post-religious world, and so as a result we have to make up new narratives that attempt to make sense of horrible things. The second thing they show, and this is something I didn't know going into the project, is that all conspiracy theories are essentially interchangeable. What I found as I was going through these myriad conspiracy theories, I thought my book, I'd have to spend 10 years of research because there's so many conspiracy theories out there. Conspiracy theories are remarkably similar. They all follow the same structure, and the structure is this: that there is evil in the world, terrorist attacks, depressions, wars, but that all of these things are perpetrated by a small group of men, it's always men, in a smoke-filled room somewhere in the world trying to further some kind of evil agenda. And what's interesting is that the actual evildoer, they're fairly interchangeable. One chapter in my book, I talk about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. People in this room know what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is. Notorious anti-Semitic hoax published in the early part of the 20th century, alleging that the Jews of the world were conspiring to, fill in the blank, revolutions, wars, depressions, all manner of evil to further their sinister Jewish agenda. What I found is that if you take sections of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and you replace the word Jew with the word Muslim, you actually get a lot of stuff that appears on right-wing websites today. If you replace the word Jew with Bilderberger or New World Order or Catholic, in some cases you get a Dan Brown novel out of it. The point is, the structure of conspiracy theories are remarkably similar, which is why I actually urge my readers in the book, I urge them to read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, not because it's true, obviously, but because it's a blueprint for so much of the conspiracism and nonsense that we see on the internet today. When I started analyzing these conspiracy theories, a lot of it is, reading material like the Protocols and looking at how it figured in with their mythology. But another thing that I did was I went out and I actually started interviewing conspiracy theorists. Now, this seems like a fairly obvious thing to do when you're writing a book about conspiracy theories, but it's actually, what I found was it's somewhat unusual. Most books about conspiracy theories are either promoting conspiracy theories, and these bookstores are full of these things, they sell very well, or they're books making fun of conspiracy theories, which is very easy to do. Their theories are often ridiculous. But very few people have actually sit down with conspiracy theorists and asked them what they think. And it's obvious why people do so. It can be very tedious, it can be annoying, as I found. But when I sat down with these people, I had two questions with them, for them. The first was, what do you believe? The second was, when did you start believing it? And at first, I thought that the first question, what do you believe, would be the more interesting one. What I found was that it actually got slightly tedious. For instance, if you ask a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, well, what do you believe happened on 9/11? They'll start telling you, well, first, Dick Cheney, he put the bombs in the building, then, his friends at NORAD shut down the entire flight defense system over North America, then this happened. And at first, I'm a former engineer, kind of a nerd, I like video games and all the sci-fi stuff, and at first I was interested in it. After a couple of weeks of hearing the same kind of sci-fi fantasy, sort of like a bad Robert Ludlum novel, like I got kind of bored of the details, and I realized I was hearing the same details over and over and over. What was much more interesting was the question of when people started believing it. Because, as I said before, conspiracy theories are narratives about why bad things happen, why evil exists in the world. But they're also narratives of distrust. Because the people who believe in conspiracy theories, obviously they don't trust the government. But as we just heard from Zadie Smith, they don't trust the media either. You know, when I told them I was an editor for the National Post in Canada, they just took it for granted that I'm a professional liar who gets his marching orders every week from George Soros or the Zionists or whoever they imagine the ultimate paymaster is. It was taken for granted that the media doesn't report the truth. And not just the government and the media and the CIA, but also NGOs. You know, there's plenty of conspiracy theories about the United Nations and so forth. So it all comes down to distrust, and a sort of nihilistic distrust. And when you ask a conspiracy theorist, when did you start believing that 9/11 was an inside job, or that Barack Obama was actually born in Kenya or whatnot, you're asking them a very personal question. You're asking them the question, when did your world fall apart? When did you start believing that everybody was lying to you? And that, in its way, is a very personal question. And I got some very interesting answers. What I found was that different people had their own points of entry into the world of conspiracies. But once they went down that rabbit hole, once the trust was broken, they became vulnerable to every conspiracy theory under the sun. You very rarely meet a person who believes in one conspiracy theory. Typically, they'll buy into one conspiracy theory, they'll get on the internet, they'll get on a few websites, they'll start watching some videos. Before you know it, they believe dozens of different conspiracy theories. And when does this distrust start? For a lot of liberals, it started not right after 9/11. I'm talking about 9/11 conspiracy theories for the moment. 9/11 conspiracy theories, their big moment wasn't right after 9/11. It was in 2003, when they found out there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And when a lot of people found out there were no WMDs, the first question they asked wasn't, well, where'd they go? The first question they asked was, what else is the government lying about? And when you ask that question, what else is the government lying about, which, by the way, is a very healthy question to ask in a democratic society, the extrapolation of that question could lead you into some very dark areas. And you start believing that the government is lying about everything, from what vaccines to take, to whether cigarettes are bad for you, to whether there are UFOs somewhere in Colorado. Because once people start asking that question, it becomes addictive. One guy who I interviewed for the book, he's actually a former NFL football player. He played defensive end for the New York Jets. He's now a successful investment banker in Toronto. He is Serbian by ancestry. And he became radicalized during the Kosovo conflict in 1999. And he started to believe, with some justification, there's always a grain of truth behind these things, that NATO wasn't telling us the full story about who was behind the Balkan Wars. And he believed that there was a campaign of lies against Serbia. And he told me that he thought that the videos showing the brutalization of Kosovar Albanians, that those videos had been doctored and had been done in a Hollywood studio. And again, once that trust had been broken, he started to see everything through the same lens. So 2 years after the Kosovo conflict, when 9/11 happened, he saw 9/11 through the same lens, and he became a 9/11 conspiracy theorist. And now he's become a Bilderberger conspiracy theorist. I don't know if anyone in the room is familiar with the Bilderbergers. It's this transatlantic NGO and conference, and there's a lot of mythology about them, but that happens to be his thing. Some folks are New World Order or Zionist or George Soros conspiracy theorist. He's a Bilderberger conspiracy theorist. But as I said before, these things are interchangeable. It doesn't matter who you think is the global puppet master. What matters is you think that somewhere, someone is pulling the puppet strings of the world and causing all these evil things to happen. In some cases, it was very personal. In some cases, I interviewed people whose children had autism, and they had become convinced that their children's autism was the result of vaccines that the children had taken, in particular the MMR vaccine. And believing that, they also came to believe that the pharmaceutical companies and the government, the FDA in particular, were lying to them about tests they had conducted on these vaccines. And if the FDA was lying to them about the vaccines, and the government was lying to protect the FDA, what else was the government lying about? And then you get to that question, what else is a lie? And then, from then on, they start believing all sorts of things. What I found was it didn't matter why people had been propelled into the world of conspiracy. You could never really bring them out again. It was very rare that you could meet a conspiracy theorist who was shall we say, a conspiracy theorist in recovery. Once that trust is broken, it's like a relationship. It's very hard to build the trust back. And one thing I confess, in the last chapter of the book, I've never won an argument with a conspiracy theorist. I spent 3 years working on the book, interviewing conspiracy theorists. Never once was I able to convince any of these people, you know what, maybe it was Al-Qaeda that did 9/11, maybe Barack Obama was actually born in Hawaii. Because for the people who adopt these things, it becomes a worldview. It becomes a form of religion. And like all religions, it becomes very precious to these people because it's an explanation for evil. And they hang on to it as a sort of security blanket to explain why bad things happen. Now, unlike religions, conspiracy theories do not supply gods. But they do supply something which might even be more important for a lot of people. They supply demons. They supply a singular address for evil upon which you can blame everything. And in some cases, they quite literally supply demons. Many of the extreme Obama birthers you talk to actually do believe that Barack Obama is either the Antichrist, or more commonly, they will call him the false prophet, who is mentioned in the book of Revelation as someone whose appearance will precede the appearance of the Antichrist. And so the political conspiracy theory actually becomes a secularized version of the religious conspiracy theory that is embedded in the book of Revelation. Because conspiracy theories are an explanation for evil, they always flourish in the aftermath of historical events where terrible things happen. In the modern era, the first great conspiracy theories emerged in the aftermath of the French Revolution. We now look back at the French Revolution and look at some of the positive ideological principles that came out of it. But at the time, of course, thousands of people were dying. Blood was running in the streets. You had the terror. And a lot of people became convinced that the French Revolution must have been applied, by the Jews, for instance. Protocols of the Elders of Zion emerged in the aftermath, or it was at least popularized in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution in World War I, when all of Europe was aflame. You also, of course, had conspiracy theories after JFK, after 9/11, and after the 2008 financial crisis, which I explain in my book. But there is also not just a spiritual, but a political function of conspiracy theories. One thing I explain to people when they ask, one of the most common questions is, I can't understand these Barack Obama conspiracy theorists. We've shown them the long-form birth certificate, and yet they persist in this. And the explanation I give to these people is that conspiracy theories act as a bridge between political ideology and reality. If you spent your entire political life believing that America is a right-wing country, that it would never elect a left-wing intellectual Harvard politician, a community organizer from Chicago, no less, and then that's exactly what America does. It breaks your view of the world. It's comforting to think that somehow that historical episode is illegitimate, that it was a hoax, that somehow if you do enough investigation and you count enough pixels on a PDF of Barack Obama's electronic birth certificate, that you can somehow discover the truth, that you could roll back history in God's eyes, and that you could show the world that this episode never really happened, and you could bring the real world into compliance with the world that exists in your ideology. And this exists on both sides of the political spectrum. Many 9/11 conspiracy theorists whom I interviewed were left-wing ideologues who had convinced themselves that America was the epicenter and font of all true evil in the world. This had become part of their mantra. When 9/11 happened, and they were forced to see a truly despicable act of evil happen in their own backyard, perpetrated by America's enemies, it did not compute. There was the cognitive dissonance that arose between their ideology, which was anti-American, and the reality, which was that this epic signature act of evil had been perpetrated by America's enemies. They were able to bring ideology and reality into a unified whole by creating a theory that somehow this act of terrorism had been inflicted on America by its own leaders. So it protects them from cognitive dissonance. It's a bridge between ideology and reality. Some questions I often get about the book: are there real conspiracies? Of course. Iran-Contra, Watergate, Teapot Dome. In Canada, we had something called the sponsorship scandal, which no one here has heard of. It involved the Liberal Party and this fundraising. It was a really sexy story. But the point is that in every country, real conspiracies do happen. They tend to be small, they tend to be grubby, they tend to be about money or sex. They don't tend to be about taking over the planet in the name of the Vatican or the Bilderbergers. That's one of the ways you can tell a real conspiracy from a bogus conspiracy theory. Another question I get is, and this is I was on the Diane Rehm show on National Public Radio, and Diane Rehm herself and a lot of the people who phoned in said, you know what, this young timer, I lived through the JFK era. That's absolutely nothing new. We had our own conspiracy theories back then. This is exactly what we went through 50 years ago. And there's some truth in that, but there's a huge difference, and that's a difference that I focused on in the book. And in one word, that difference is the internet. Back in the era of JFK, if you were a conspiracy theorist and you wanted to get the message out, it was really hard. You couldn't go to an editor of a newspaper or a magazine like Lewis Lapham or something. They'd say, forget it, I'm not publishing your nonsense. There were gatekeepers to the media. So you went around wearing a sandwich board, or you called into radio stations, or you handed out leaflets on the street. We make fun of these things, but if you're a conspiracy theorist, this was the only option you had. Community access television at 2 a.m. You really didn't have many other options because the media had real gatekeepers. The difference now is folks like me. I'm the editor of the op-ed page at the National Post, which is, Canada's Wall Street Journal, I like to think. I walk around very puffed up. I'm a gatekeeper. I decide what news gets disseminated. Conspiracy theorists have no time for someone like me. They forget that guy. I'll just put it on a blog. I'll make a YouTube video. They can completely get around people like me. It's something that was completely impossible in the JFK era. Which is why in the book, what I say that conspiracism has been transformed by the internet just as much as social media or pornography. 99.9% of conspiracism is now done on the internet. They barely even have conferences anymore. What's the point of doing that? It's when you could just create a website or a YouTube video. How many people here have seen Loose Change? This is often I go to college campuses and they're giving it out. Some guy in a T-shirt is giving it out, and this is a really slick video purporting to explain why 9/11 was an inside job. The thing was made for about $20,000. Many of the best videos are made for free. This kind of technology was obviously completely non-existent in the JFK era. So the ease of entry into the media market for conspiracy theorists has gone down by several orders of magnitude since the JFK era. But the internet has had another effect, which in many ways is more disturbing because it doesn't affect just conspiracy theorists, it affects mainstream media consumers. And that is the segmentation of media markets into silos. 50 years ago, it didn't matter if you were a conspiracy theorist, in order to get the news, you had to either read a newspaper, watch TV, or listen to the radio. That was the only way you were going to get the news. It didn't matter how crazy you were. Chances are, if you lived in New York, you read the New York Times or some other mainstream newspaper. There was no other way of getting the news. These days, the people I interviewed for this book, they didn't read the newspaper. The radio is full of propaganda, like NPR, God forbid, TV. In some cases, they didn't even look at websites. What they did is they woke up in the morning, and they're in their inbox, and they'd show me. They'd have 50 messages from their various conspiracist pals from around the world giving them updates on news items they've been following. And this is their source of news. They're 50 pen pals from around the world. They're even beyond websites. And this is a really scary thing, and I see this all the time, even among colleagues of mine at the National Post. They'll tell me about stories. I said, well, where'd you hear that story? Oh, it's all over my Usenet group or something like that. Well, you should check that out. It sounds stupid. But people are going to silos. And again, this is on both sides of the political spectrum. It's on the left and on the right. And this goes into another difference between now and the JFK era. Is a lot of times I'm finding that it's actually middle-aged people who are the most vulnerable to conspiracism. It's a very interesting phenomenon. When I was in university, I assumed, oh, God, I'm surrounded by crackpots here. That's, anarchists and Trotskyists and whatever, people clutching copies of Ayn Rand and Scientologists and all sorts of things. I said, I can't wait till I grow up and everyone's normal. Turns out I grow up, Fox News comes around, and Grandpa has become this raging conspiracist maniac who watches Glenn Beck. And this is I went to Jon Stewart's Rally for Sanity in Washington a couple of months ago, and they had all these hilarious signs, and the funniest said, Glenn Beck, stop scaring my dad. And the reason for this, it has to do with the internet, because I noticed there are a few young people, as I now refer to them in the crowd, anyone under 30, and these people know how to use the internet. Someone sends them a crackpot story, they say, this doesn't look good. They search for it on Wikipedia or on Snopes or some other quasi-reputable site where they can see if something's nonsense. The people I interviewed who are 50 or 60 or 70 or even 80, they're hip enough to use the internet. They're just not hip enough to use it properly. So when their brother-in-law sends them a link to something about how Barack Obama isn't a US citizen, they just forward it to their whole address book. And you're laughing because it sounds funny, but what I just described is the source of 90% of the BS on the internet. And again, I got into a huge amount of trouble in my newspaper. I wrote an article, and the title was "Who Taught Bubby and Zeta How to Use the Internet?" I got hate mail in Yiddish, which is the first time. Now, then you get to a fundamental question: does it hurt America? Because this is a question I often get. People say, "Oh, come on, these crackpots having their fun on the internet. It's who cares? This is a hobby for these people, and for many people, it is a hobby." And I want to emphasize, I'm not against the X-Files. I'm not against Thomas Pynchon. I'm not against Dan Brown, whose novels I've read. I confess it. I found them entertaining. I thought the movies were terrible, but the books were fun. I'm not against conspiracy theories being used for entertainment. They are fun. They're titillating. It's the main reason that I was able to go on the radio to promote my book. People are interested in it. However, when people make conspiracy theories their worldview, it becomes impossible to have any kind of public discourse. And the example I give is, how are you supposed to have an intelligent argument, forget argument, discussion, with someone about health policy if they think that Obamacare is a secret plot to put Grandma before a death panel? What if Grandma thinks it's a plot to put her before a death panel? You can't have a discussion with that person. Lewis Lapham said something. He said, well, you can't have a genuine discussion with someone who is merely a liar or rhetorician. Is that how you pronounce it? If someone is blinded by conspiracism, that's a third category of someone you can't have an argument with. You can't have a discussion about the legitimacy of Barack Obama's presidency or his policies with someone who thinks that he's an illegal alien. You can't have a discussion about anti-terrorist policy or foreign affairs or security with someone who thinks that 9/11 was an inside job. It's just impossible. They live in different realities. You can't span those realities with rationality. And I guess this is part of the thing that I found so disappointing about writing this book is I went into journalism. The previous speaker spoke very eloquently about why we write. I write I'm an op-ed page editor, and I have this incredible faith, or I used to, in the power of rational ideas to convince people of things. Otherwise, I wouldn't run an op-ed page. Because what's the point of inviting people to write 800-word articles to convince the world of things if you don't think that the rationality of their argument can actually change people's minds? I've become much less convinced that rational discourse can convince people of things. And I see it in my own journalism. There are many distinguished intellectuals and academics in the crowd. I know that. I think I may be one of the few people who's actually a working editor in a newsroom. And I do this every day. I not only manage the print pages of the National Post opinion section, I also help manage the website. And I see what the internet is doing to my business. When I'm making decisions about which articles to promote on our website, someone sends in something about, take your pick, Herman Cain's latest video or Sarah Palin, or I know it's going to get 50,000 hits. Whereas someone sends in something about fiscal policy, I'm like, oh, that's so boring. In a way, it was better 30 years ago when editors like me were blind to how boring certain subjects were. Because as an elitist, we could put the worthy stuff on the front page and we could pretend that people were reading it. The big enemy of good journalism and rationality now is the hit counter, the number of hits articles get on the web. And it's, I'll put an article up on the web, including my own, 20 minutes later I'm checking the hit counter. And you come to know which subjects get hits and which don't. And guess what? It's often the most superficial, fringe subjects. We used to have a joke that, this is a couple of years ago, if you put Christina Aguilera's name in a headline, you instantly get 20,000 hits. So, Christina Aguilera introduces new fiscal policy would, get a ton of hits. So, I recognize that I'm part of the problem. And the question is, what can we do about this? What can we do? And obviously, Hannah Arendt supplies inspiration. She supplies inspiration because she shows that being a truth teller is a noble thing. Even if the truth is difficult to accept, even if it may take a lot of time and attention to process, even if it may be boring at times, or banal, the truth is important. But I think we also have to accept the fact that the truth can be really difficult. I mean, that's why people like Hannah Arendt are such heroes, telling the truth and accepting the truth when it's very difficult. And writing this book showed me how difficult the truth is for ordinary people. It's very easy for wealthy, well-educated people with brilliant children and grandchildren to accept the world as it is sometimes, because the world for these people is a very sunny place. Many of the people I interviewed for the book weren't in that place. They were confronting circumstances in their life, failed businesses, medical situations, which perhaps drove them into the arms of conspiracism. And you have to appreciate that. For those people, it really is difficult to accept the truth. And I confronted it right here in upstate New York. By coincidence, last night, flew in from Toronto. I went to go eat by myself at a pizza restaurant. I was the only guy in the place. I was sipping my coffee. And the waitress came and talked to me. And this being America in 2011, it took her about 8 seconds to talk about how horrible Obama is. And I was like, oh, great, here I go. I'm talking to the man or woman on the street. I'm being a journalist. Tell me about it. But it was very sad, She told me she had a mother who's in her 50s, 2 degrees, can't find a job. She herself was working for what I assume is a very low wage in a pizza restaurant. Failed businesses. She has a 3-year-old, very little hope for the future. And so it didn't surprise me that she hated Obama. She found Obama was responsible for all her problems. And then 10 minutes later, as you might predict, she started talking about immigrants, She talked about a successful immigrant family that she knew that were running not 1 but 2 restaurants now, 3 cars. And she claimed, falsely I think, that they were receiving all kinds of crazy government support because they were Mexican. And what she was saying began to creep into something approaching a conspiracy theory. And I thought it was implausible, but I listened to her, and I realized that for people like that, and for tens of millions of other people around the United States, it's really hard to accept a reality where the United States is a second-rate power compared to China, where you're in danger of losing not one, but 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the economy is a mess, where people's mortgages are underwater. And I realize a lot of this stuff maybe doesn't apply to the people in this room, but for people to whom it does apply, it is much easier to find one single person or group of people to blame for all their problems than it is to analyze the extremely complex subject of, for instance, mortgage-backed Wall Street securities, which most people can't understand. So you blame high taxes, or you blame Obamacare, or you blame Obama himself. The good news, I think, for fighting conspiracy theories is that the United States, for all its problems now, is actually a wonderful place in one great respect that, as a Canadian, I've always admired. And that is its capacity for intellectual self-awareness and change. When you look back at the civil rights struggle, you don't look at Canada or Europe, you look at the United States. And in the space of just a generation or two, the United States succeeded in making racism, not just racism, sexism, homophobia, all kinds of forms, pathological forms of discrimination, basically removing them from the polite discourse of politics and even dinner party conversation in the space of basically 30 or 40 years. An unbelievable achievement in the history of human sociology, that in such a short period of time you could so radically change people's attitude towards such basic isms as racism and sexism and anti-Semitism too. The United States may be one of the least anti-Semitic countries in the world, including Israel. And if the United States can do this, if the United States can get rid of those other toxic isms from its intellectual discourse, maybe it can do the same for conspiracism. I think one step, obviously, is to engage in conferences like this, which is why it was such a delight for me to come here and attend. Another step is to read my book. But a third step, I think, is to recognize the problem as a serious problem and not just make fun of people. It's fun to make fun of Tea Party types or 9/11 truthers or, the people handing you leaflets on the streets. But it is a symptom of a serious problem. And I think you have to take the problem seriously. It's what I've tried to do in my research, and I urge other people to do the same in theirs. Thank you.
Glenn, a few minutes? Thank you. Yeah. As edifying in person as you are on the page.
Thanks. I'm going to soundbite that for my paperback edition.
But don't say I'm a poet, because
okay,
it's not going to
say
do any
you're
good.
A public intellectual.
So lots of things to think about, one of which is something that you talk about in your book, which is this foundational American myth that every person is capable of becoming, of rising up to a certain other space than the one they were born into. This is a deep-held individualistic freedom idea. And so one of the things that occurs to me when you're talking and in your book is about the whole notion of failure and how difficult it is for the woman that you met last night to feel that she has personally failed. So she had to kind of counter that idea with a sort of projection of failure into a much larger space. And I think that might be part of the core of what you're talking about. The other thing that you talk about and which I tried to mention in my introduction, is that there's a system, there's another core space which is very American, which is where to put a place for faith in the secular domains that most of us live in. So that faith space is also kind of an orphan and needs to attach itself to something or some way. And so this idea of individual capacity, failure, and faith are also locked into what you keep calling the truth. But Arendt didn't believe there was any such thing as the truth. There were different kinds of truths, right? And so in our rationalist world, truths I'm talking too much. I'm going to ask a question. I'm trying to put together a kind of scenario so I can ask you something that makes any sense.
I'm ready to riff off it right now.
All right. The truth is connected to something like facts, but she also believed that facts are fungible, that they're really very hard to pin down as objects in the real world because they're interpretations, right? So the whole thing comes back for me to this interesting dyad of lying and truth-telling, in which you tell yourself a fable, which is not a truth, in order to accommodate your failure and your need to believe in something or your faith space. And I guess the question I have comes right from Arendt, who says, I'm going to quote her, she says that lies, since they are often used as substitutes for more violent means, are apt to be considered relatively harmless tools in the arsenal of political action. So in some ways, and I'm just very interested to know that your anxiety about this group of people who is doing distortions of a kind for their own protection, whether there's actually a real danger, or is it a kind of way in which a certain need is being met?
Yeah, the need exists at a very individual level, and this is something I thank you for reminding